In the spring of 1847, along the fertile plains of South Carolina's tobacco country, Edmund Hargrove, a white planter worth over $100,000, vanished without a trace from his own estate. 3 days later, his body was discovered at the bottom of a dry well, his neck twisted at an angle that suggested a fall, or something far worse. Within 6 months, his young widow, Catherine Hargrove, married the dead man's most trusted servant, a man named Josiah, who had been enslaved his entire life until the very week of Edmund's death. By 1869, Josiah owned more land than any black man south of Richmond and died the wealthiest freedman in 3 counties. The authorities never asked a question, the neighbors never spoke a word, and the truth stayed buried for over 60 years until a forgotten journal surfaced in a crumbling courthouse basement, written by someone who knew exactly what happened that spring night. Before we continue with the story of Josiah and the Hargrove fortune, if you're fascinated by dark mysteries rooted in America's hidden past, make sure to subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. The journal revealed not just a story of one man's rise from bondage to unimaginable wealth, but a meticulous chronicle of manipulation, calculated patience, and a crime so perfectly executed that it became invisible in plain sight. The Hargrove plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres. Edmund Hargrove, though shrewd in business, was known for his coldness and was not well liked. He was, however, undeniably successful, and his wealth was the envy of the county. The household included Edmund, his considerably younger wife, Catherine, whom he had married only 2 years prior, and 14 enslaved people. Among them was Josiah, a man in his early 40s who had grown up on the estate and learned to read and write in secret, an illegal skill in South Carolina. Edmund used Josiah as a personal assistant, trusting him with sensitive financial records and correspondence. Catherine Hargrove was 24, from a declining planter family. Her marriage to Edmund was reportedly unhappy. He treated her more as a decorative fixture. She often retreated to reading, gardening, and occasionally conversing with Josiah, one of the few people on the estate who could hold an intelligent discussion. By early 1847, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Edmund had become increasingly paranoid about his finances, isolating himself and becoming more dependent on Josiah. Josiah remained an enigma to most, quiet, efficient, and possessed of an uncanny ability to anticipate his master's needs. If he harbored resentment, he kept it locked behind a mask of perfect servitude. The spring brought heavy rains, agitating Edmund. On the evening of May 3rd, he summoned Josiah to his study and closed the door. What transpired in that room was never fully known, but when Josiah emerged, his expression was unreadable. That night, Edmund retired to his bedroom alone, telling Catherine he would be inspecting the eastern fields at first light. Catherine spent the evening in the parlor, reading until nearly midnight. The next morning, Edmund did not appear for breakfast. Josiah organized a methodical search, and it was late afternoon when the body was discovered at the bottom of an old, abandoned stone well on a remote corner of the property. Edmund's neck was broken, his body crumpled, with no signs of a struggle. The local constable, Robert Finch, conducted a cursory investigation and concluded it was a tragic accident. Edmund had stumbled in the early morning darkness. 4 days later, the funeral was held. Catherine, pale but composed, stood by the grave with dry eyes. Josiah stood at a respectful distance. Within a week, Catherine summoned a lawyer. To the county's shock, Edmund's will, witnessed and notarized just 3 weeks before his death, contained a provision that immediately freed Josiah from bondage and bequeathed him $500 in cash and a small parcel of land. Neighbors whispered, but the timing of the will, so close to his death, raised questions only in quiet parlors, never directly to Catherine or Josiah. In a society built on rigid hierarchies, openly challenging a dead white man's will was unthinkable. Josiah accepted his freedom and inheritance with the same quiet composure he had shown in servitude, moving to a modest cabin on his new land. Catherine, meanwhile, remained at the main house, managing the plantation with surprising competence. Then, in November of 1847, exactly 6 months after Edmund's death, Catherine and Josiah were married in a private ceremony in the Hargrove house parlor. The scandal was immediate and explosive. A white woman marrying a formerly enslaved black man was illegal in South Carolina in 1847. When confronted by outraged neighbors, Catherine calmly explained that they had exploited a legal loophole. The ceremony was performed by a Massachusetts minister, where such unions were legal, and the marriage technically took place on her private property. This audacious, carefully constructed argument momentarily paralyzed the authorities. Catherine and Josiah carried on, living openly and expanding their holdings. By the time the legal system finally moved to challenge the marriage 2 years later, they had protected their assets, and the authorities quietly dropped the matter, realizing they were dealing with sophisticated adversaries. But the true darkness lay in the night of May 3, 1847. The journal, found in 1909 and written in Josiah's hand, was not a confession but a meticulous record of events. The entries began in March 1847, chronicling a conversation where Catherine confided that Edmund had become increasingly violent, striking her and threatening to sell several enslaved people, including Josiah. Josiah listened silently, but later, alone, he began to think. Edmund was worth over $100,000, and if he died childless, the estate would go to Catherine, whose new husband would legally control the fortune. The subsequent journal entries detailed a plan so intricate it read like a piece of elaborate clockwork. Josiah subtly fed Edmund's financial paranoia, mentioning the overseer Thaddeus Crenshaw's suspicious meetings and planting ledgers with minor discrepancies. He suggested Edmund inspect remote areas of the property personally. On April 20th, Josiah noted that he had guided Edmund to draft a new will that freed Josiah and included a modest inheritance for his loyalty. Edmund, isolated and suspicious of everyone else, agreed to every suggestion. The entries from early May were chilling. On May 2nd, Josiah noted he had spent the afternoon clearing brush near the old abandoned well, removing the rotted wooden cover and leaving the area to appear natural with a path leading right to the danger. On the evening of May 3rd, after his meeting with Edmund, Josiah wrote a single damning sentence. "He will inspect the eastern fields at dawn, as I suggested he should." The journal contained no explicit confession of pushing Edmund, but it was evidence of psychological manipulation so skillful that Edmund Hargrove had walked to his own death, believing it was his own idea. The May 4th entry was brief. The constable suspects nothing. Catherine performed her role without error. The will has been validated. We are free. In the immediate aftermath, Catherine assumed control with a competence that raised quiet suspicion, proving herself a capable manager who secured better prices for tobacco than Edmund. Josiah established himself as a skilled agricultural consultant. The marriage brought absolute and permanent social isolation. They were completely ostracized by the community. Yet, unlike other outcasts, Catherine and Josiah appeared entirely unbothered by this rejection. They seemed to thrive. Josiah and Catherine expanded their landholdings steadily throughout the 1850s, diversifying their investments into railroad bonds, textile mills, and urban real estate. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, they controlled over 2,000 acres and had an estimated net worth exceeding $200,000, making Josiah one of the wealthiest black men in the entire South. They navigated the catastrophic war years with calculated precision, quietly selling their tobacco, converting assets into gold and northern securities, and emerging in 1865 with their fortunes substantially increased, allowing them to purchase entire estates for fractions of their pre-war value. Despite the political upheaval of Reconstruction, the violent resistance of white supremacist groups, and the social annihilation they faced, Josiah and Catherine remained untouched. Their property was never burned, their lives never threatened, and their business dealings were never seriously disrupted. This immunity was attributed by some to Josiah's cultivation of powerful allies, or Catherine's white skin. But Josiah's journal revealed a darker, more systematic approach, an insurance policy of documented secrets. Beginning in 1850, Josiah kept detailed records of the vulnerabilities of nearly everyone in his orbit: affairs, embezzlement, wartime profiteering, financial fraud, and tax evasion. This journal was a network of vulnerability, a web of documented secrets that made him too dangerous to attack and too useful to exclude. When violence threatened or business deals fell through, Josiah would have quiet conversations or send carefully worded letters, gently letting people know that he knew things and that their cooperation was in everyone's best interest. It was blackmail, subtle and carefully calibrated. Catherine, a full partner in this strategy, maintained correspondence that served as an intelligence-gathering operation, while her charity work gave her access to financial records and personal information. Together, they constructed a sophisticated surveillance apparatus. By the late 1860s, Josiah's influence was undeniable, but he remained fundamentally unknowable, silent, enigmatic, accumulating wealth and power with relentless efficiency. The first serious challenge came in 1868, when Samuel Garrett, a young, idealistic attorney from Pennsylvania, arrived, hired by Edmund Hargrove's distant relatives to investigate Edmund's death and the estate. Garrett found significant discrepancies between the final will, which freed Josiah, and earlier versions, and noted that both witnesses to the final will were now dead. He interviewed the retired constable, who admitted the initial investigation had been brief and he had never verified Josiah's account of the timeline. Armed with these findings, Garrett confronted Catherine and Josiah directly. They received him cordially. When Garrett admitted he had no direct evidence of murder, Josiah nodded thoughtfully and suggested Garrett speak with several individuals who knew Edmund well, including a retired judge and a banker. Garrett spent the next 3 weeks conducting interviews, and a consistent but unexpected picture began to emerge. Edmund Hargrove had been paranoid, unstable, and increasingly erratic in his final months. The judge claimed Edmund sought advice about dissolving his marriage, and the banker revealed Edmund had withdrawn large sums of cash, consistent with someone planning to flee. What Garrett did not realize was that every one of these witnesses had been carefully coached, reminded of past indiscretions, offered favorable business terms, or simply trusting Josiah's version of events. The portrait of Edmund as a disturbed man who wandered into danger was not entirely false, but his paranoia had been deliberately cultivated and amplified by the couple. Garrett's investigation stalled. He returned to Pennsylvania empty-handed, his reputation damaged. However, his inquiries had shaken something loose. In late 1868, a series of anonymous letters began circulating, claiming to be from a former worker who had witnessed Catherine and Josiah planning Edmund's murder and manipulating his will. Public meetings demanded a new investigation, but the letters lacked verifiable details. Catherine and Josiah's response was unexpected and aggressive. They hired their own investigators and offered a reward to find the author. This shifted the narrative, making them victims of slander. Within 2 months, the letter writer was identified as a former overseer, a man already bearing a grudge who was arrested and jailed for criminal libel. The scandal quickly evaporated. What the public didn't know was that the letters were actually written by Josiah himself, a preemptive strategy to neutralize lingering suspicions by allowing them to be aired and then systematically debunked, using a carefully selected scapegoat. It was a ruthless calculation executed with cold precision. The 1870s brought triumph and shadow. Josiah's wealth grew, and he became an influential Republican figure, funding schools and churches, presenting himself as a self-made man. Privately, however, the relationship with Catherine began to fray. The journal entries hint at growing tensions. Catherine became increasingly interested in spiritualism and reform movements, which Josiah viewed as dangerous distractions and threats to their facade. In 1873, Catherine suffered a miscarriage, devastating her. She withdrew, becoming unreliable and prone to emotional outbursts, which Josiah noted threatened their position. In January 1874, a stranger arrived, Daniel Stokes, a journalist from Boston, writing a book about successful freedmen. During the interview, Stokes pressed Josiah on the suspicious timeline around Edmund's death and mentioned he had spoken with the doubting attorney Samuel Garrett. Josiah ended the interview cordially but immediately investigated Stokes. He discovered Stokes was not writing the advertised book. He was investigating unsolved crimes from the antebellum period, specifically murders committed by the enslaved against their masters. Josiah's journal entry was revealing. Stokes represented the greatest threat because he was motivated by ideology, the belief that the truth must be exposed, making him immune to conventional threats or bribes. Josiah considered several strategies but realized he needed to make the investigation collapse from within. Through his network, he learned Stokes was deeply in debt. Josiah arranged for a business partner to offer Stokes a lucrative position as a private researcher in Boston, with the implicit condition that he abandon his current projects immediately. Stokes accepted, returned to Boston, and never published anything about the Hargrove estate, the threat neutralizing itself through the strategic application of financial incentive. But Catherine had been profoundly shaken by Stokes's visit, asking questions about prosecution and the seizure of their fortune. She began having nightmares about Edmund's ghost. The tension reached a breaking point in the summer of 1875 when Catherine announced she wanted to leave South Carolina and move north to escape the crushing weight of the past. Josiah refused to move north, arguing that abandoning their established network would be to abandon their security. The ensuing bitter argument lasted weeks. Then, on a sweltering August afternoon, Catherine walked to the old abandoned well where Edmund Hargrove had died 28 years earlier. She stood staring down into the darkness for over an hour. When Josiah found her, she chillingly replied that she was keeping him company, claiming she could feel Edmund down there, waiting, knowing that eventually they would join him. Josiah wrote in his journal that he realized in that moment that Catherine was no longer fully rational, that the years of secrecy and isolation had broken something essential in her mind. That night, Josiah made a final, cold decision, writing that Catherine had become a liability whose instability threatened everything they had built. The entry ended with a chilling sentence. "She has always been willing to do what was necessary. I pray she remained so until the end." What happened next would not be fully understood until Josiah's journal was discovered decades later. In September 1875, Catherine Hargrove became seriously ill. The local physician, Dr. Marcus Brennan, diagnosed her with gastric fever, but she continued to deteriorate rapidly, suffering from severe pain, weight loss, tremors, and episodes of delirium where she cried out about shadows and voices from beneath the floor. Nurses who attended her spoke of strange behaviors. Catherine would ask to be taken to the window facing the abandoned well, staring out and whispering as though holding a conversation. One nurse, Ruth Denton, heard her say clearly, "I know you're waiting, Edmund. I'll bring him to you soon." Troubled by Catherine's consistent, coherent ravings about events from 1847, Mrs. Denton began taking notes in her small diary. Josiah visited Catherine's sick room twice daily, bringing her meals personally and dismissing the nurses. After these visits, Catherine often seemed more agitated, though in her lucid moments, she welcomed his visits with an expression of resigned acceptance. In the third week of October, Catherine's condition took a dramatic turn with a high fever and a strange grayish pallor. Dr. Brennan began to suspect something beyond natural illness. On the morning of October 18th, Catherine summoned Josiah for what she called her final conversation, insisting on privacy. When Josiah finally emerged nearly an hour later, Mrs. Denton recalled his face was like a man who had seen his own grave opened before him. Catherine died the following afternoon, October 19th, 1875. Mrs. Denton was alone with her at the end. Catherine's final words were, "Tell Josiah that Edmund is satisfied now. Tell him we'll all be together soon beneath the ground where we belong." The official cause of death was listed as gastric fever and nervous exhaustion. Josiah's journal entries from August through October of 1875 describe a methodical process of poisoning. He had settled on a combination of arsenic trioxide and lead acetate, substances that would produce symptoms consistent with gastric fever while being virtually undetectable in 1875. He administered the poison gradually, mixing it into Catherine's food and drink, carefully calculating the doses to produce a slow, irreversible decline. The entries are clinical in their detail, describing dosages, symptoms, and the reactions of the doctor and nurses, satisfied that none suspected anything beyond natural disease. There is no emotion in these passages for the first several weeks. No expression of regret or justification was initially recorded by Josiah, beyond the chilling sentence written on September 2nd. "She has become a threat to everything we built. This is necessary. I have protected us before, and I will protect us again, no matter the cost." But as Catherine's death became imminent, Josiah's journal began to change. He started describing vivid, disturbing dreams of standing at the old well, hearing Edmund's calm, patient, and welcoming voice. "There's room for all of us down here, Josiah. You knew it would end this way." The delusions bled into reality. On October 10th, Josiah found muddy footprints leading from his bedroom door to his bed, footprints that matched the boots buried with Edmund 28 years earlier. On October 15th, just 4 days before Catherine's death, he heard her voice calling from the cellar. Descending into the darkness, he found a patch of disturbed earth and, in its center, Edmund's gold wedding ring. But when he raced upstairs, the ring was still on Catherine's finger. Returning to the cellar, the duplicate ring was still there. He pocketed the second ring and filled the depression with his bare hands. The entry describing the incident reveals Josiah's terror. "I no longer know if I am the hunter or the hunted. I fear I have been calculating in the wrong currency all along. Edmund has been waiting in that well, in that darkness, growing stronger while I grew wealthy, and now he is ready to collect what I owe him." The most disturbing revelation came on October 18th, the day before Catherine's death, during their final private conversation. Josiah's journal revealed Catherine's shocking confession. She had known he was poisoning her since mid-September, recognizing the taste of arsenic from its use in tobacco pest control. But instead of resisting, she had accepted the poison, ready to die since that August afternoon when she felt Edmund's presence at the well. "You think you have been protecting us, protecting our fortune, our position," Catherine had told him, according to Josiah's account. "But there is nothing to protect. Josiah, we are already dead. We died the moment Edmund fell into that darkness. Everything since then has been a ghost's dream." She did not regret Edmund's death. She planned it willingly, but she now understood that some acts create obligations that transcend law and death itself. "Edmund is waiting, and when I join him, he will be satisfied enough to wait a little longer for you, but not much longer." Josiah tried to deny the poisoning, but Catherine laughed, a sound more terrible than any scream because it contained genuine amusement at the absurdity of their lies. She asked him to stop pretending and finished with a final, chilling absolution. "I forgive you for this, Josiah, because I am complicit in all of it, and my forgiveness is as worthless as your guilt. But Edmund does not forgive. Edmund will never forgive." Catherine then asked Josiah to finish the work quickly, to increase the dosage. Josiah agreed, feeling as though he was signing his own death warrant. He prepared a final massive dose of the poison and brought it to her the next morning in a cup of broth. She drank it without hesitation and died 7 hours later on October 19th, 1875. The journal entry from the night of October 19th, the night of Catherine's death and burial, is one of the longest and most anguished in the entire collection. Josiah described standing alone in his study after the funeral, surrounded by the evidence of his success. He had accomplished everything he had set out to achieve. "And yet," he wrote, "I feel as though I have spent 3 decades climbing a mountain, only to discover upon reaching the summit that I have been descending into a chasm all along. I am wealthy, but I am alone. I am successful, but I am terrified. I am free, but I am trapped. And Edmund, poor dead Edmund, is the one who has won after all. Because he is at rest in his grave, while I must continue living with what I have done, must continue pretending that any of this was worth the cost." The entry concluded with a sentence that has puzzled historians ever since. "I have won, but God help me, I have also lost everything that mattered." In the weeks following Catherine's death, the strange incidents intensified. Workers reported seeing a figure in white near the old well, and objects in the main house were constantly disturbed. Josiah's personal belongings would reappear in chillingly significant locations: his razor left beside the well, his glasses on Catherine's grave, and his pocket watch found in the cellar where the duplicate ring had been. Josiah's sleep became profoundly disturbed. He frequently woke up standing in locations he didn't remember walking to, like the cemetery between Edmund's and Catherine's graves. Even after locking and barricading his door, he would wake up elsewhere, moved by a force beyond his conscious control. In December 1875, The haunting reached a terrifying climax. Working late in his study, Josiah heard Catherine's distinctive, slightly uneven footsteps in the hallway, the soft creak of leather shoes and the rustling of skirts. Every rational part of his mind insisted this was impossible, but the sound was unmistakable. Compelled, he followed the footsteps as they led him out of the silent house, across the lawn, and towards the old well where Edmund had died 28 years earlier. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the well. As Josiah peered into the darkness, he heard something that turned his blood to ice. A man's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling his name from deep within the earth. It was Edmund's voice, calm and almost conversational. "Josiah, I know you can hear me. I've been waiting for you to come. Catherine is here now and we're both waiting. It's time, Josiah. Do you understand now?" The voice continued, patient and inexorable, taunting Josiah's cleverness. "You thought you were so clever. You took everything from me. You built an empire on my bones, but cleverness isn't wisdom. Debts must be paid." Then, softer, feminine, Catherine's voice joined in. "Come home, Josiah. Come home to us. You've been running for so long and you must be so tired. Let's rest together now in the darkness where we belong." Josiah fled back to the house, bolting his door and piling furniture against it, spending the rest of the night huddled with his loaded pistol. His journal entry concluded with a haunting question. Have I finally crossed a line that cannot be defended by cleverness alone? Or was I born in that darkness? And have I simply been pretending to be human all these years when I am really something else entirely? The remaining journal entries become fragmented and disturbing. Josiah describes more impossible phenomena: self-moving shadows, doors opening themselves, and the persistent smell of decay. What disturbs him most is not the external manifestations, but an internal hollowing. He is no longer entirely himself, experiencing memory lapses and seeing expressions on his reflection that he did not choose. On Christmas Eve 1875, Josiah considered suicide, placing the pistol barrel against his temple. But he could not complete the action, not because he wanted to live, but because he feared what would come after. "If I die by my own hand, I will descend immediately to where they are waiting, and I am not ready. I am a coward at the last, as I have been a coward throughout." Just when we thought we'd uncovered the darkest secrets of Josiah's rise to power, the true horror reveals itself in his complete psychological unraveling. If this narrative has given you chills, share it with someone who appreciates complex historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support deep dives like this, and subscribe so you never miss these disturbing tales from America's hidden past. Because what happened to Josiah in his final years proves that some debts can never be escaped. Josiah lived for another 8 years after Catherine's death, but they were years of increasing isolation and profound psychological deterioration. He withdrew from public life, his once sharp mind clouded, and his body stooped as if carrying an invisible weight. He hired and fired a succession of servants who later spoke of a house filled with dread, where strange sounds echoed, and the master was often found wandering the grounds before dawn. One housekeeper reported hearing Josiah holding conversations with multiple people in his study, only to find him alone. Visitors noted his perpetual anxiety, his trembling hands, and his constant need to glance over his shoulder. In what appeared to be a desperate attempt at atonement, Josiah began acts of philanthropy. In 1879, he made a substantial donation to establish the Catherine Hargrove Memorial Academy, and in 1881, he funded a new hospital wing and endowed a fund for the cemetery's maintenance. Those who read his journal understood these were not tributes, but expiations, desperate attempts to balance an unbalanceable account. In 1879, he wrote, "I am simply a fool believing that money can wash away blood, that buildings can atone for murder." By 1882, Josiah's health took a severe turn, marked by a chronic cough and chest pains. His mental state completely collapsed. He began asking visitors if they could see Edmund or Catherine standing in the corner of the room. The final entries written in a shaky hand reveal his despair. They are not angry anymore. They are simply waiting. And their patience is more terrible than any rage could be, because their patience means they are certain of their victory. In February 1883, Josiah drafted a will that distributed his entire fortune among various charitable institutions, with the stipulation that all organizations must publicly acknowledge the money came from a man seeking to make amends for unpardonable crimes. When his lawyer urged him to reconsider, Josiah refused. "Something is pulling at me, pulling me down into the earth where I should have gone 36 years ago." Josiah died on March 7, 1883, at approximately 3 in the morning, the same time of day that Catherine had died, found slumped over his desk. Beside his body was a final, single sentence written in his hand. "I am ready now. Take me to where we all belong." He was buried simply beside Edmund and Catherine. His will was executed without challenge, his $300,000 estate divided among black educational institutions and charitable organizations. The truth of what happened was finally unearthed in 1909 when Josiah's journal and Ruth Denton's diary were discovered. While the documents created a brief sensation, all the principals were long dead, and no investigation was reopened. Historians debated the authenticity and meaning, questioning whether Josiah was a man driven mad by guilt, a victim of genuine supernatural phenomena, or simply destroyed by the far more terrible ghosts of his own conscience. The true nature of the events, whether Josiah murdered Edmund by luring him to the well and poisoned Catherine, or if his guilt-ridden mind convinced him of murders that never occurred, remains ultimately unknowable. The documents offer possibilities but no definitive answers. Perhaps the most significant question is whether guilt itself, regardless of its objective basis, can function as a form of punishment more terrible than any court could impose. Josiah lived 36 years, accumulating wealth and power, but if his journal is to be believed, those years were a prolonged torture. Even today, the land where the Hargrove plantation stood remains vacant, too troubled by legal complications. Local residents still speak of the patch of woods near the old well site, saying that on certain nights, you can hear voices or see 3 figures standing at the edge of the woods. One tall like Edmund, one slight like Catherine, one stooped like Josiah in his final years, watching as though waiting. These stories may be folklore, but perhaps they are warnings that the foundations we build our lives upon matter, that the means by which we achieve success cannot be divorced from the ends we reach, and that every choice creates obligations that must eventually be satisfied. Josiah rose from slavery to wealth and influence through intelligence, patience, and possibly through 2 unpunished murders. He died tormented, free, but imprisoned by guilt. His name is now largely forgotten, a footnote in history, a cautionary tale about the costs of ambition pursued without regard for conscience. This mystery reveals the dark complexities of ambition, survival, and justice in a society built on profound injustice, and raises the question of whether true escape from our sins is ever really possible, or whether we carry them with us always, growing heavier until they finally drag us down to where we've always belonged. What do you think happened in those final years? Was he haunted by genuine supernatural forces, or by the far more terrible ghosts of his own conscience? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to The Forgotten Liturgy, hit that notification bell, and share this video with anyone who appreciates the darker corners of American history.